The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant rain through the concrete arteries of the city, whispering secrets that only the lonely could hear. It was that peculiar hour when day surrendered to dusk, when the amber streetlights began their nightly vigil, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward promises never kept. In the heart of downtown, where glass towers pierced the sky like monuments to ambition, two worlds existed in perfect, oblivious harmony. Or perhaps, perfect discord. Thomas Harrington adjusted his Italian wool coat against the chill as his driver, Marcus, held open the door of the midnight black Bentley. The leather interior still held the warmth of the heated seats, a cocoon of luxury that insulated him from the harsh realities of the street beyond. Through the tinted windows, he watched the city's inhabitants scurry along the sidewalks like ants in their daily procession. Workers heading home to modest apartments, mothers pushing strollers with wheels that squeaked against the uneven pavement, teenagers laughing too loudly as they spilled out of the subway entrance. "Shall I wait here, Mr. Harrington?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the practiced deference of someone who had learned never to question his employer's increasingly peculiar evening routine. "No," Thomas replied, his breath forming a small cloud in the crisp air. "I'll walk back to the office. The fresh air helps me think." It was a lie, of course. The fresh air did nothing for his thoughts, which had grown increasingly tangled in recent months, like thorny vines wrapping around the foundation of his carefully constructed life. But Marcus nodded with the same professional acceptance he'd shown for the past 15 years, and Thomas watched the Bentley glide away into traffic, disappearing among the sea of lesser vehicles, like a shark returning to deep waters. Thomas's destination was only 3 blocks away, but those 3 blocks might as well have been 3 different worlds. With each step away from the gleaming financial district, the buildings grew smaller, the storefronts more weathered, the people more real. By the time he reached Riverside Park, his handmade Oxford shoes had carried him from his kingdom of steel and glass into something that felt uncomfortably like the realm of actual human experience. The park was modest by any standard, a simple green space carved from the urban landscape, featuring playground equipment that had seen better decades and benches that bore the accumulated weight of countless stories. But it was here, on a particular bench facing the playground, that Thomas Harrington, billionaire, empire builder, destroyer of neighborhoods, had developed the strangest habit of his 58 years. He sat down on the weathered wooden planks, the same bench he had claimed for the past 8 months, and allowed his gaze to settle on the playground before him. Children's voices rose and fell like a symphony he had forgotten how to understand, their joy piercing the evening air with a purity that made something deep in his chest ache in ways he refused to examine too closely. A little girl with pigtails pushed a boy on the swing set, both of them laughing as he soared higher and higher. A mother sat on a blanket nearby, reading a book while keeping one eye on her toddler who was making elaborate sandcastles in the designated play area. Teenagers occupied the basketball court at the far end of the park, their sneakers squeaking against the asphalt as they called out plays in languages Thomas's expensive education had never taught him to speak. The language of belonging, of community, of unconditional acceptance. He told himself he came here for market research. Harrington Industries was, after all, in the business of urban development, and understanding family dynamics was crucial for designing the kinds of residential complexes that would maximize both profit and occupancy rates. That's what he told his assistant when she asked about the hour-long gap in his evening schedule. That's what he told the board members who occasionally questioned his walking routes. That's what he told himself when he woke at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment, wondering why success felt so much like solitude. But the truth was something Thomas Harrington had spent decades learning not to acknowledge. The truth was that he came here because something about this place called to a part of himself he had buried so deeply that he had almost forgotten it existed. Something about the sound of children's laughter made his chest tight in ways that had nothing to do with the expensive cigars he occasionally indulged in. Something about watching families together made him feel like a man standing outside a warm house in winter, pressing his face against the glass to glimpse a life he could see but never touch. Meanwhile, 6 miles away in a neighborhood that Thomas's urban planning committee had marked for revitalization on their development maps, Michael Chen Harrington was finishing his second shift of the day. The community center where he worked occupied a converted Victorian house that had somehow survived 3 different attempts at demolition, its gingerbread trim and bay windows standing as defiant reminders of a time when beauty was built to last rather than to impress. The walls of Michael's office were covered with children's artwork, hand-traced turkeys for Thanksgiving, crayon drawings of families that included everyone from grandparents to family dogs, and construction paper hearts that proclaimed world's best social worker in glitter and hope. His desk was a study in organized chaos. Case files stacked beside coffee cups that had gone cold hours ago, legal textbooks bookmarked with grocery store receipts, and a framed photograph of an elderly Chinese woman whose smile seemed to light up the room even in the fading daylight. Michael rubbed his eyes, which burned from reading legal briefs by the light of a desk lamp that flickered intermittently, and glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:30 p.m. In normal circumstances, he would have been home hours ago sharing dinner with his grandmother Popo in the small apartment above the herb shop she had run for 40 years. But these weren't normal circumstances. These were the circumstances of a man who worked double shifts to pay for night law school, who studied case law during his lunch breaks, who had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and determination that burned like a small, steady flame in his chest. The case file opened before him told the story of the Martinez family, 3 children, ages 6, 8 and 10, who had been temporarily placed in foster care after their father lost his job at the factory, and their mother had what the state delicately termed a mental health crisis. Michael had been working with them for 6 months, helping the parents navigate the maze of social services, job training programs, and counseling sessions that stood between them and the return of their children. It was work that required infinite patience, endless paperwork, and a capacity for hope that most people would have found exhausting. But Michael approached each case with the kind of meticulous care that his grandmother had taught him to apply to her herb garden, tending to each family like a plant that needed exactly the right combination of sunlight, water, and time to flourish. His phone buzzed with a text message from his study group, reminding him about the contract law review session that would start in an hour at the law library. Michael looked at the stack of case files still waiting for his attention, then at the textbooks that represented his evening's second job, the job of becoming the kind of lawyer who could protect families like the Martinezes from systems that seemed designed to separate rather than support. He closed the Martinez file with a gentle snap and reached for his jacket, a wool coat that had been his father's, purchased during better times and carefully maintained through worse ones. As he locked his office door and walked through the community center's main room, he paused to straighten one of the children's drawings that had come loose from the bulletin board. It showed a house with smoke curling from the chimney, stick figures holding hands in front of a garden, and a sun that took up half the sky, radiating joy in yellow crayon. The artist had signed it Miguel Martinez, age 8, and had added a note at the bottom, "This is my family when we're together again." Michael stood there for a moment, holding the drawing in hands that had learned to be gentle from years of working with broken things. Broken families, broken systems, broken children who still believed in the possibility of wholeness. He carefully reattached the drawing to the bulletin board, making sure the tape was secure, then gathered his books and stepped out into the October evening. The walk to the bus stop took him past the herb shop where Popo was closing up for the day, her small figure moving efficiently behind the glass storefront as she organized the day's receipts and prepared the next morning's inventory. The shop smelled of ginseng and dried chrysanthemums, star anise and healing teas that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that medicine came in many forms, not all of them found in prescription bottles. Michael tapped on the glass, and his grandmother looked up with a smile that transformed her weathered face into something radiant. She gestured toward the back of the shop, where a plate covered with a kitchen towel waited on the small table where she took her meals. Even working 2 jobs and attending night school, Michael was still, in Popo's eyes, a growing boy who needed to be fed properly. But tonight, there wasn't time for the slow ritual of shared dinner and gentle conversation. Tonight, there was contract law to review, cases to study, and dreams to chase with the kind of quiet determination that had carried him through 7 years of undergraduate school, paid for with financial aid and weekend jobs, through social work training funded by scholarships and summer internships, and now through law school that he attended 1 class at a time, 1 semester at a time, 1 step closer to becoming the kind of man who could build rather than merely repair. As the bus carried him toward the university district, Michael pressed his forehead against the cool window and watched the city pass by in a blur of lights and possibilities. Somewhere in that maze of buildings and ambitions, in boardrooms and corner offices he had never seen, decisions were being made that would affect families like the Martinezes. Decisions about which neighborhoods deserved investment and which deserved destruction, which communities would thrive and which would be scattered like leaves in the wind of progress. Michael didn't know that at this very moment, as his bus moved through the evening traffic, Thomas Harrington was sitting on a bench in Riverside Park, watching children play games that seemed to belong to a world he had never learned to inhabit. He didn't know that the man who had signed the papers that would reshape his neighborhood sat alone in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the echoes of laughter that sounded like memories he couldn't quite grasp. But somewhere in the space between the community center and the law library, between the herb shop and the playground, between the world of those who build and those who are built upon, destiny was weaving its patient threads, preparing to reveal that the distance between a father and son could be measured not just in miles, but in choices made and unmade, in love offered and love refused, in the space between what was and what might have been. The autumn wind carried these secrets through the city streets, past the glowing windows of the community center, past the memorial bench where Thomas Harrington sat in solitude, past the bus where Michael Chen Harrington studied contract law by the overhead reading light. Secrets that would soon transform 2 separate lives into one inescapable truth. The memory always came to Michael in fragments, like sunlight filtering through the leaves of the old maple tree that had once stood in Popo's backyard. Tonight, as he sat in the fluorescent-lit law library, surrounded by the whispered conversations of fellow students and the soft rustle of turning pages, the scent of star anise from Popo's evening tea seemed to transport him back 25 years, to a time when the world was smaller and safer, when love came in the form of carefully prepared meals and bedtime stories told in 2 languages. He was 7 years old again, sitting at Popo's kitchen table with his homework spread before him like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. His mother, Lin Chen, moved around the small kitchen with the graceful efficiency of someone who had learned to make magic from modest ingredients. She was preparing his favorite dinner: steamed fish with ginger and scallions, jasmine rice that filled the air with its delicate fragrance, and vegetables from Popo's garden that still carried the taste of earth and sunshine. "Michael," his mother had said that evening, her voice carrying the musical cadence that made English sound like poetry when she spoke it. "Tell me about your day. What did you learn?" He had been struggling with a math worksheet, the numbers swimming before his eyes like tadpoles in a pond. "I don't understand fractions, Mama," he had confessed, his small fingers tracing the pencil marks he had erased and rewritten so many times that the paper was beginning to wear thin. Lynn had set down her wooden spoon and moved to sit beside him, her teacher's instincts overriding the fatigue that always seemed to shadow her eyes in those days. She worked 3 jobs: teaching ESL classes at the community college during the day, tutoring immigrant children in the evenings, and cleaning office buildings on weekends. But she always had time for Michael's homework, always had patience for his questions, always made him feel like he was the most important person in her carefully constructed universe. "Look," she had said, taking his pencil and drawing a circle on a fresh piece of paper. "This is a whole family. Now, if we divide it into pieces," she drew lines through the circle, creating wedges. "Each piece is still part of the family, yes? The family is not broken. It is just shared differently." Michael remembered nodding, not because he understood fractions any better, but because his mother's explanation had made him feel safe in a way that went beyond mathematics. Even at 7, he had sensed the undercurrents of worry that flowed through their small apartment like an underground river. The bills that Popo and his mother discussed in hushed Mandarin when they thought he couldn't hear. The phone calls from lawyers that made his mother's face go pale and tight. The letters that arrived in official-looking envelopes and disappeared quickly into Popo's desk drawer. But that night, with the kitchen warm from cooking and his mother's hand steady over his as she helped him work through fraction problems, the world had felt whole, complete, like one of those circles she had drawn, unbroken despite the lines that divided it into manageable pieces. 3 weeks later, Lin Chen collapsed during her evening tutoring session at the community center. The doctors said it was an aneurysm, a weakness in the blood vessel that had been there all along, invisible and patient, waiting for the moment when stress and exhaustion would finally tip the delicate balance between life and something else. She died on a Tuesday morning while Michael was at school, learning about long division from Mrs. Patterson, who would later drive him to the hospital, where Popo waited with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and words in Mandarin that sounded like prayers and protests all at once. The days that followed existed in Michael's memory like scenes from a movie he had watched but not lived through. Funeral arrangements made in 2 languages. Casseroles delivered by neighbors whose kindness felt overwhelming and insufficient all at once. Social workers with gentle voices and clipboards who asked questions about next of kin, about custody arrangements, about a father whose name appeared on Michael's birth certificate, but whose presence had never been part of their daily reality. Thomas Harrington. Michael remembered Popo saying the name like it tasted bitter in her mouth, remembered the way she would pause whenever the social workers asked about him, as if she were choosing her words from a selection that included several different kinds of truth. Yes, he was Michael's biological father. No, he had never been involved in the boy's life. No, he had never provided financial support. Yes, they had attempted to contact him through his lawyers regarding custody arrangements. The lawyers. Even at 7, Michael had understood that when adults mentioned lawyers, it meant that simple solutions were about to become complicated ones. He remembered sitting in Popo's living room, surrounded by boxes of his mother's belongings that somehow needed to be sorted into categories: keep, donate, remember, while grown-ups in serious clothes talked about him as if he weren't there. "Mr. Harrington has declined to assume custody," one of the social workers had said, her voice carrying the kind of practiced neutrality that suggested she had delivered this type of news before. "However, Mrs. Chen, your grandmother, is willing and able to provide care, and given the existing relationship and the child's expressed preference." Popo had reached for Michael's hand then, her fingers small and strong and smelling faintly of the medicinal herbs she ground each morning for her customers. "You stay with Popo," she had whispered in Mandarin, then repeated in English for the benefit of the room. "You stay with family." Family. The word had felt different after that day, smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because it no longer included his mother's laugh echoing through their apartment, no longer included bedtime stories about brave princesses and clever foxes, no longer included the sense of security that came from being someone's whole world. but larger too because it had been tested and had proven strong enough to hold him when everything else fell apart. Michael blinked, and the fluorescent lights of the law library came back into focus. Around him, fellow students continued their quiet conversations about tort law and constitutional precedents, their voices a gentle murmur that brought him back to the present moment. His contract law textbook lay open before him, dense paragraphs about consideration and breach of contract that seemed to blur together as his mind struggled to shift from memory back to the immediate demands of his evening studies. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that Popo changed religiously every few months, was his mother's jade bracelet. A delicate circle of deep green stone that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that. It was the only piece of jewelry Lin Chen had owned, the only thing of monetary value in an apartment filled with books and hope and carefully tended plants. Popo had given it to him on his 18th birthday, along with a letter that his mother had written shortly after his birth. The letter was in his backpack too, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become permanent, the ink slightly faded but still readable in his mother's careful handwriting. "My dearest Michael," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that something has happened to me, and Popo has decided you are old enough to understand the truth about your father and the choices I made." Michael had read the letter hundreds of times over the past 14 years, but tonight, surrounded by law books and legal precedents, certain passages seemed to carry new weight. "I met your father during my first year of graduate school, when I was working as a research assistant for a professor who was consulting on a urban development project. Thomas was young then, maybe 26 or 27, and he seemed different from the other wealthy men I had encountered. He talked about building communities rather than just buildings, about creating spaces where families could thrive. I thought he meant it. Our relationship lasted 8 months. When I told him I was pregnant, he offered to pay for an abortion. When I refused, he offered money for you to be raised somewhere else, by someone else, with a different name, and no connection to his family or his reputation. When I refused that too, he simply disappeared. His lawyer sent papers making it clear that he would never acknowledge you, never support you, never be part of your life in any way. I want you to know that I don't regret my choice. You have been the greatest joy of my life, the truest proof that love can exist without conditions or contracts. But I also want you to understand that your father's rejection was about his own fears, his own limitations, not about your worth or your right to exist. If you choose to find him someday, I hope you will remember that forgiveness is not about what others deserve, but about what we need to heal ourselves. And if you choose never to seek him out, I hope you will remember that families are not always made by blood, but by the daily choice to love and be loved. You are my son, Popo's grandson, and heir to a tradition of strength that goes back generations. Never let anyone make you feel like you are less than whole. Michael closed the wooden box and returned it to his backpack, then looked down at his contract law textbook with new focus. The section he had been studying dealt with the concept of consideration, the idea that every valid contract required something of value to be exchanged between parties, some mutual benefit that made the agreement binding and enforceable. For the first time since he had begun law school, Michael found himself thinking about consideration not just as an abstract legal principle, but as a fundamental question about human relationships. What did people owe each other? What constituted fair exchange in the realm of family, of community, of shared responsibility for the world they inhabited together? His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena Vasquez, the legal aid attorney who had been mentoring him through his internship at the community center. "Found something interesting in the property records. Can we meet tomorrow after your shift? Might be relevant to your neighborhood revitalization research." Michael responded quickly, agreeing to meet at the small cafe near the community center where Eleanor often worked on cases that required more privacy than the open workspace of the legal aid office. He had been researching the history of his neighborhood for a paper on urban development law, trying to understand how communities like his had survived decades of economic pressure and political neglect. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he packed up his law books and prepared for the bus ride home, was that Elena had spent the past 3 months uncovering a web of property transfers and legal manipulations that stretched back to his grandfather's generation. What he didn't know was that the interesting information she had discovered would fundamentally change not just his understanding of his neighborhood's history, but his understanding of his own place in a story that had been decades in the making. As Michael walked through the university campus toward the bus stop, the October wind carried the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace, reminding him of autumn evenings when he was small, when Popo would make hot tea and tell him stories about their family's history in China, about the courage it took to build a new life in a foreign country, about the importance of remembering where you came from while still reaching toward where you hope to go. He didn't know that 6 miles away, Thomas Harrington was sitting in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the city lights and wondering why success felt so much like emptiness. He didn't know that his biological father spent his evenings on a bench in Riverside Park, unconsciously seeking connection with the very community his business practices were systematically destroying. But somewhere in the space between memory and possibility, between the law library and the playground, between a mother's last letter and a father's unexamined guilt, the threads of their separate stories were beginning to weave together into something that would soon become inescapable. A reckoning 25 years in the making, guided by the patient hand of a woman who understood that justice, like good medicine, sometimes required time to reach its full strength. The jade bracelet in Michael's backpack caught the streetlight as he boarded the bus, its surface reflecting a story that was far from over. What moment in Michael's childhood hit you the most? Was it his mother's final letter, the father's cold rejection, or Popo's unwavering love? Drop a comment and let me know what part of this story resonates most deeply with you. The morning of October 15th began like any other for Thomas Harrington, with the ritualistic precision that governed every aspect of his carefully orchestrated life. His alarm chimed at exactly 5:30 a.m., not the jarring electronic shriek that most people endured, but a gentle melody composed specifically for his sleep cycle by a sound engineer whose services cost more than most people earned in a month. The penthouse apartment gradually illuminated itself through an automated system that mimicked the natural progression of sunrise, even though the floor-to-ceiling windows revealed only the pre-dawn darkness of a city that never truly slept. Thomas moved through his morning routine with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had eliminated spontaneity from his life decades ago. 45 minutes on the Peloton bike that faced the east-facing windows, watching the real sunrise compete with the artificial one programmed into his lighting system. 20 minutes in the steam shower that cost more than a luxury car and felt exactly as empty as the apartment that contained it. Breakfast prepared by his housekeeper, Maria, who spoke to him in careful, formal English despite having worked for him for 12 years, consisted of steel-cut oats with imported berries and coffee beans that were flown in weekly from a small plantation in Jamaica. By 7:15 a.m., Marcus was waiting with the Bentley, and Thomas was reviewing the day's agenda on his tablet as they glided through morning traffic. Board meeting at 9, conference call with the Singapore investors at 11, lunch with the mayor's development committee at 1, and at 3 p.m., a site visit to the Riverside district, where Harrington Industries was preparing to break ground on their most ambitious project yet, a mixed-use development that would transform 15 blocks of underutilized urban space into luxury condominiums, boutique shopping, and upscale restaurants. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that he spent his evenings sitting in the very neighborhood he was planning to erase. But business was business, and sentiment was a luxury he had learned to avoid. The Riverside district represented prime real estate that had been undervalued for decades due to what his market research delicately termed demographic challenges. With the right vision and sufficient capital investment, those challenges could be transformed into opportunities. What Thomas didn't anticipate was that his carefully scheduled day would intersect with the unscheduled life of Michael Chen Harrington in ways that would shatter the invisible barriers that had kept father and son in separate orbits for 25 years. Michael's morning had begun at 5 a.m., not by choice but by necessity. The Martinez family's emergency hearing had been moved up to 9 a.m., which meant he needed to review their case file one more time, prepare his testimony as their advocate, and still arrive at the courthouse early enough to meet with Elena Vasquez before the proceedings began. He had learned to function on minimal sleep, but today the exhaustion felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge that 3 children's futures would be decided by people who would never know their names, never see Miguel's drawings of his imagined reunited family, never understand that bureaucratic efficiency and human healing operated on completely different timelines. Popo had been awake when he left the apartment at 6:30, already preparing the medicinal teas that her elderly customers depended on for everything from arthritis pain to insomnia. She pressed a thermos of jasmine tea into his hands, along with a container of steamed pork buns that were still warm from the bamboo steamer, her way of ensuring he would eat something substantial before facing a day that required both mental acuity and emotional resilience. "Today is important day," she had said in the mixture of English and Mandarin that served as their private language. "You help families stay together. This is good karma." Michael had kissed her weathered cheek, breathing in the familiar scent of medicinal herbs and the lavender soap she had used for as long as he could remember. At 73, Popo moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been tested by decades of physical labor. But her mind remained sharp as the cleaver she used to prepare herbs, and her capacity for love seemed to expand rather than diminish with age. The bus ride to downtown took 45 minutes, and Michael used the time to review his notes for the hearing, while mentally rehearsing the points he wanted to make about the Martinez family's progress. Mr. Martinez had completed his job training program and had been hired as a maintenance supervisor at a medical complex. Mrs. Martinez was responding well to her medication and had been attending therapy sessions religiously. Both parents had completed their parenting classes and had demonstrated significant improvement in their ability to provide stable, nurturing care for their children. On paper, it should have been a straightforward case. But Michael had learned that family court proceedings rarely followed the logic of fairness or common sense. Too often, the system seemed designed to punish poverty rather than address its root causes, to separate families rather than provide the support they needed to heal and thrive together. The courthouse was a monument to institutional authority, marble floors that echoed with every footstep, carved columns that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small, and fluorescent lighting that gave everyone's skin a sickly greenish pallor. Michael found Elena in the small conference room they had reserved, her laptop open and surrounded by case files that represented dozens of families navigating the labyrinth of social services, family court, and bureaucratic requirements that stood between them and stability. "How are you feeling?" Elena asked, looking up from her computer screen with the kind of focused concern that made her such an effective advocate. At 45, she had the bearing of someone who had learned to project confidence even when facing impossible odds. But Michael could see the fatigue around her eyes that came from years of fighting battles that shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. "Nervous," Michael admitted, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from her. "The kids have been in foster care for 8 months. Miguel asked me last week if his parents had forgotten about him. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that love doesn't disappear just because families get separated by systems they don't understand? Elena nodded, closing her laptop and giving him her full attention. You remind him that there are people fighting for his family every single day, and that sometimes the most important battles take longer than we wish they would. She paused, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read stress and hope in equal measure. Michael, I need to tell you something. After we finish with the Martinez hearing today, I want to show you something I've discovered in my research, something about your neighborhood and your family's history there. Before Michael could ask what she meant, a court clerk appeared in the doorway to inform them that the hearing was about to begin. They gathered their files and walked down the hallway toward courtroom 3B, where Judge Patricia Morrison presided over family court with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that could either reunite families or destroy them, depending on the quality of evidence presented and the unpredictable alchemy of legal proceedings. The hearing lasted 2 hours, during which Michael presented his careful documentation of the Martinez family's progress, while the state's attorney questioned whether 8 months was sufficient time to address the systemic issues that had led to the children's removal in the first place. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez sat in the gallery behind Michael and Elena, holding hands and trying to project the kind of stability that bureaucrats found reassuring, while their children remained in foster homes across the city, waiting for adults to decide their fate. In the end, Judge Morrison ruled in favor of reunification with a 6-month probationary period and continued supervision from social services. It wasn't the complete victory Michael had hoped for, but it was enough. The Martinez family would be together for Halloween, for Thanksgiving, for the gradual rebuilding of trust that comes when people are given the chance to heal in each other's presence rather than apart. Michael and Elena were leaving the courthouse at 11:30 a.m., both of them emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic, when Elena's phone rang with a call that would change the trajectory of the entire day. "It's James Wright," she said, recognizing the number of a private investigator who sometimes helped with her more complex cases. "He's been researching property records for the Riverside development case." She answered the call, and Michael watched her expression shift from curiosity to alarm to something that looked like disbelief. "Are you certain about this?" Elena asked, her voice taking on the controlled intensity she used when dealing with information that could fundamentally alter a case. "The dates match exactly? And the names?" She listened for another moment, then said, "We'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't discuss this with anyone else until we arrive." She hung up and turned to Michael with an expression he had never seen before. Excitement mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Michael, I need you to come with me to James's office. What he's discovered about the property records, it's not just relevant to your research paper. It's relevant to you personally, to your family, to everything." They took a taxi through downtown traffic that moved with the sluggish persistence of molasses, Elena making cryptic phone calls, while Michael stared out the window and tried to imagine what kind of information could warrant the urgency he heard in her voice. The buildings blurred past, office towers and retail spaces, and the invisible boundaries that separated different economic worlds from each other with surgical precision. James Wright's office occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, its elevator creaking with the complaint of machinery that predated modern safety regulations. James himself was a thin man in his 60s, who dressed like someone who had learned that blending into crowds was often more valuable than making impressions. His office was organized chaos, filing cabinets that looked like they might collapse under the weight of accumulated information, computer monitors displaying databases and genealogy websites, and walls covered with charts and timelines that tracked the kind of connections most people never thought to look for. "Elena," he said, standing as they entered his cramped office, "and this must be Michael. Son, you're going to want to sit down for this." Michael remained standing, his law school training having taught him to be skeptical of dramatic declarations. "What exactly have you discovered?" James walked to one of his computers and pulled up a scanned document that looked like it had been photographed in a basement archive somewhere. "This is a property deed from 1952. The original sale of the land where your grandmother's herb shop currently sits, along with the entire block around it." He pointed to a name highlighted in yellow. "The original owners were the Chen family, your mother's family. They were forced to sell during a period of discriminatory housing policies that specifically targeted Chinese-American property owners." Michael felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Who bought it?" James clicked to the next page of the document, where another name was highlighted in a different color. Harrington Enterprises, LLC, owned at the time by Harrington, Thomas Harrington's grandfather. Elena moved closer to the computer screen, her legal training evident in the way she immediately began searching for loopholes and implications. "Michael, this means the land your family has lived on for 70 years was illegally acquired through discriminatory practices that would never hold up under modern legal scrutiny. But that's not the most significant part," James continued, pulling up another document. "I cross-referenced the property records with birth certificates and genealogy databases. Michael, your biological father, Thomas Harrington, has been unknowingly sitting on land that was stolen from your family 3 generations ago. And there's more." He clicked to a photograph that showed a small bronze plaque mounted on a park bench. Michael leaned closer to read the inscription, "In memory of Lin Chen, beloved teacher and mother. Her love lives on in the community she served." "The bench where Thomas Harrington sits every evening," James said quietly, "is a memorial to your mother. It was installed by the community center after she died, funded by donations from the families she tutored and the colleagues she worked with. He's been sitting there for 8 months, Michael. 8 months of unconsciously seeking forgiveness from the woman whose son he abandoned." The office fell silent, except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Michael stared at the photograph of the memorial plaque, at his mother's name, rendered in bronze letters that had been polished smooth by weather and time, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger exactly, but something larger and more complex. Justice, perhaps, or destiny finally revealing the pattern that had been hidden in plain sight for 25 years. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone delivering information that couldn't be taken back. "James, show him the development plans." James pulled up a new set of documents, architectural renderings and site maps that showed the Riverside district as Thomas Harrington envisioned it. Luxury condominiums rose from the spaces where the community center currently stood. Boutique shopping replaced Popo's herb shop and the small businesses that served immigrant families. The playground where children currently ran and laughed had been transformed into a meditation garden for wealthy residents who could afford to live in what the marketing materials called an oasis of urban sophistication. Michael studied the plans with the growing realization that this wasn't just about property development. This was about erasure, the systematic elimination of a community that had survived discrimination, economic hardship, and decades of neglect, only to face destruction at the hands of the same family that had originally stolen their land. "When does construction begin?" Michael asked. "The final permits were approved last week," Elena replied. "Groundbreaking is scheduled for December 1st, unless—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Michael understood the implication. "Unless someone with legal standing and sufficient evidence challenged the development. Unless someone who understood both the law and the community being threatened decided to fight back. Unless a son chose to confront the father who had spent 25 years pretending he didn't exist." Michael looked at the computer screen one more time, at the memorial plaque bearing his mother's name, at the development plans that would erase everything she had worked to build and protect. Then he looked at Eleanor, whose expression combined professional determination with something that looked almost like maternal pride. "What do we need to do?" he asked. "If you're enjoying this story of justice, family secrets, and unexpected revelations, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives that prove truth really is stranger than fiction. Your support helps us bring you these deeply human stories that remind us all of the power of perseverance and the complexity of family bonds. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the city when Michael Chen Harrington made the decision that would transform him from someone who merely survived into someone who chose to act. The silence in James Wright's office stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with the weight of 25 years of unspoken truth. Michael stared at the computer screen where his mother's memorial plaque glowed in digital reproduction, the bronze letters of her name seeming to pulse with significance he was only beginning to understand. Elena watched his face carefully, her legal training having taught her to recognize the moment when information transforms from mere data into something that demands action. "I need to see the original documents," Michael said finally, his voice carrying the steady calm that people sometimes discovered in moments of crisis. "All of them. The property deeds, the birth certificates, the development permits, everything." James nodded and began pulling files from cabinets that seemed to contain the accumulated secrets of the entire city. "I've been working on this for 3 months, ever since Elena asked me to research the Riverside development. At first, it was just standard due diligence, checking to make sure all the permits were properly filed, all the community notifications were sent out according to law. But then I started noticing patterns." He spread documents across his desk like tarot cards, revealing an unwelcome future. Property transfers that followed suspicious timelines, community meetings that were scheduled during working hours when most residents couldn't attend, environmental impact studies that somehow failed to account for the disruption to local businesses and schools. "It's all legal," Elena said, her tone carrying the bitter frustration of someone who had spent years watching injustice hide behind technicalities. "Morally reprehensible but legal. Thomas Harrington's lawyers are very good at what they do." Michael picked up one of the documents. A community impact assessment that described his neighborhood in language so clinical it drained all humanity from the description. High-density, low-income housing, underutilized commercial spaces, aging infrastructure requiring significant municipal investment. Nowhere in the assessment did it mention that high-density, low-income housing meant families like the Martinezes, who worked multiple jobs to pay rent and still found ways to help their neighbors when emergencies arose. Nowhere did it acknowledge that underutilized commercial spaces included Popo's herb shop, which had been providing affordable healthcare to immigrant communities for 40 years. "They're going to offer buyouts to current residents," James explained, pointing to another section of the development plan. "Generous ones by legal standards. About 60% of current market value for residential properties and slightly more for businesses. Most people will take the money because they can't afford to fight City Hall. And those who refuse," Elena's expression darkened, "eminent domain proceedings. The city will claim the development serves the public good, increased tax revenue, job creation, urban renewal. Individual property owners don't stand much chance against that kind of institutional pressure." Michael set down the documents and walked to the window, overlooking the street where ordinary people moved through their lives, unaware that their futures were being decided in offices like this one by people they would never meet, according to principles they had no voice in shaping. Below, he could see a woman pushing a stroller while talking animatedly on her phone, probably arranging childcare or coordinating with family members about dinner plans. A teenager in a school uniform hurried past carrying a violin case, rushing to a lesson or practice session that represented someone's carefully saved money and carefully nurtured dreams. These were the people who would disappear when Thomas Harrington's vision became reality. Not because they were failures or because they lacked ambition, but because they lacked the kind of wealth that translated into political influence, the kind of connections that could turn phone calls into policy changes. "Michael," Elena said gently, "I need you to understand something. What we're talking about here, challenging this development, it's not going to be easy. Harrington Industries has unlimited legal resources. They have relationships with city council members, with the mayor's office, with federal agencies that oversee urban development funding. We would be fighting the entire system. But we would be fighting with the truth," Michael replied, still looking out the window. "And we would be fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." He turned back to face them, and something in his expression had changed. The quiet social worker who helped families navigate bureaucratic mazes had been joined by someone harder, more focused, someone who had inherited his grandmother's persistence and his mother's sense of justice, and who was ready to use both. "James, I need you to find out everything you can about Thomas Harrington's schedule. Where he goes, when he goes there, who he meets with. I especially need to know about his evening routine." Michael paused, remembering the memorial plaque and the significance it represented. "Elena, can you prepare a legal challenge to the development permits? Something that will at least delay construction while we gather more evidence." Elena was already making notes on her legal pad. "I can file for an injunction based on improper community notification and failure to adequately assess environmental impact. It won't stop the project permanently, but it might buy us a few months." "A few months should be enough," Michael said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that. The plan forming in his mind was still vague, more intuition than strategy, but it centered around a truth that felt both terrifying and inevitable. After 25 years of separation, it was time for father and son to meet. Meanwhile, 6 miles away in the climate-controlled sanctuary of Harrington Tower, Thomas was finishing his lunch meeting with the mayor's development committee when his assistant, Rebecca, approached his table with the kind of careful discretion that suggested important information delivered at an inconvenient time. "Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, leaning close enough that the other diners couldn't overhear, "I just received a call from legal. There's been an injunction filed against the Riverside project. Something about improper community notification procedures." Thomas excused himself from the table and stepped into the restaurant's lobby where he could speak more freely. "What kind of injunction? Who filed it?" "A legal aid attorney named Elena Vasquez, representing something called the Riverside Community Preservation Coalition. Marcus is already on his way to pick you up. The lawyers want to meet this afternoon to discuss strategy." Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that always accompanied unexpected challenges to his carefully laid plan. The Riverside project represented more than just another development opportunity. It was his chance to transform the neighborhood where he spent his evenings, to replace the constant reminder of his own isolation with something clean and profitable and free from the complications of human messiness. The Bentley was waiting at the curb when he emerged from the restaurant, Marcus holding the door with his usual professional efficiency. As they drove through midday traffic toward the law offices of Peterson, Klein and Associates, Thomas found himself thinking about the memorial bench where he would sit in a few hours, assuming this legal complication could be resolved quickly enough to maintain his evening routine. He didn't know that the woman whose name was engraved on that bench had given birth to his son. He didn't know that the legal aid attorney challenging his project had spent months uncovering the connection between his family's wealth and the systematic displacement of immigrant communities. He didn't know that in a cramped office across town, his biological son was studying architectural plans that would erase everything the boy's mother had worked to build and protect. But somewhere in the space between ignorance and revelation, between the luxury of the Bentley and the fluorescent-lit urgency of James Wright's office, destiny was preparing to collapse the distance that had kept two lives in separate orbits For a quarter of a century, the memorial bench that had drawn Thomas Harrington into unconscious proximity with his abandoned child was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would transform them both. The October afternoon was growing shorter, shadows lengthening across the city like fingers reaching toward truths that could no longer remain hidden. And in the careful choreography of legal proceedings and family secrets, justice was preparing to reveal itself in ways that none of them could have anticipated, even as they moved inexorably toward the moment when the past would finally demand its reckoning with the present. The law offices of Peterson, Klein and Associates occupied 3 floors of a building that had been designed to intimidate through sheer architectural authority. Marble lobbies and mahogany conference rooms, oil paintings of distinguished men in expensive suits, and the kind of thick carpeting that absorbed sound and seemed to muffle dissent before it could be properly voiced. Thomas had been meeting with these lawyers for 15 years, and their ability to transform complex moral questions into manageable legal technicalities was one of the services he paid them handsomely to provide. "The injunction is temporary," senior partner David Peterson explained as they gathered around a conference table that could have seated a small army. "Standard procedural challenge based on community notification requirements. We can have it overturned within 2 weeks, maybe 3 at the outside." Thomas studied the legal documents that Rebecca had arranged in neat folders before him, each one representing a different aspect of the challenge to his project. "Who is this Elena Vasquez? What does she want?" "Legal aid attorney," replied junior partner Sarah Klein, consulting her laptop. "Graduated from State University Law School 15 years ago, worked for Morrison and Associates for 5 years before switching to legal aid. Specializes in housing rights and community development issues. Clean record, no disciplinary actions, moderately successful track record in cases involving tenant rights and zoning disputes." "So this is about money," Thomas concluded, his mind already moving toward the kind of practical solutions that had served him throughout his business career. "Make her an offer. Whatever she's being paid by this community coalition, we'll double it to make this go away." Peterson and Klein exchanged glances that suggested they had encountered this particular blind spot in their client's thinking before. "Thomas," Peterson said carefully, "not everyone can be bought. Some people are motivated by principles rather than profit margins." Thomas felt a flicker of irritation at the implication that he didn't understand human motivation. He had built an empire by understanding exactly what people wanted and figuring out how to provide it more efficiently than his competitors. The idea that someone would choose conflict over compensation struck him as either naive or performative, a kind of moral posturing that would collapse under sufficient financial pressure. "Everyone has a price," he said firmly. "Find out what hers is." What Thomas Harrington didn't understand, as he sat in that mahogany-paneled conference room planning to purchase his way out of inconvenience, was that Elena Vasquez had already been offered her price 15 years ago. Harrington Industries had tried to buy her family's house for a previous development project, offering enough money to relocate to a better neighborhood, to send her daughter to private school, to build the kind of secure, middle-class life that immigrant families dream about when they sacrifice everything to come to America. Elena had refused then, choosing to fight a legal battle that lasted 3 years and ultimately failed. She had lost her family's house anyway, but she had also learned something valuable in the process, that some victories were worth more than success, and some defeats were worth more than surrender. She had learned that dignity could not be purchased, and that home was not something that could be rebuilt with money alone. But Thomas Harrington had never learned those lessons, because he had never been forced to choose between comfort and conscience, between financial security and the more complicated securities of community and belonging. He lived in a world where problems could be solved through the application of sufficient resources, where human relationships could be managed through careful contracts and appropriate compensation. It was a world that was about to collide with realities he had spent 58 years learning to avoid. As the afternoon legal meeting concluded with assignments and timelines and strategies for neutralizing the community coalition's challenge, Thomas felt confident that this particular obstacle would be resolved with the same efficiency that had characterized every other challenge to his business interests over the past 3 decades. The Riverside project would proceed on schedule. The community coalition would accept whatever settlement his lawyers negotiated, and by Christmas he would be looking at construction sites where families currently lived their complicated, messy, beautifully human lives. Marcus was waiting in the Bentley outside the law offices, and Thomas settled into the leather interior with the satisfaction of someone who had handled an unexpected crisis with appropriate decisiveness. It was 4:30 p.m., which meant he had time to return to his office for final calls and emails before beginning his evening routine. By 6:15, he would be sitting on his memorial bench, watching children play in the fading light of another October day, unconsciously seeking absolution from the very community his lawyers were working to eliminate. He had no way of knowing that at this very moment, Michael Chen Harrington was walking through that same community, documenting the families and businesses that would disappear if the development proceeded as planned. He had no way of knowing that his biological son was taking photographs of the herb shop where his grandmother had taught him that healing came in many forms, of the community center where his mother had tutored immigrant children in the evenings after her day job, of the playground where he had once built sandcastles and dreamed about having a father who would push him on the swings. Michael moved through the neighborhood with the careful attention of someone who understood that he might be creating a historical record, documenting a way of life that could vanish as completely as morning fog under the pressure of urban development. He photographed Mrs. Kim arranging vegetables outside her grocery store, the hand-lettered signs in 3 languages that helped customers navigate unfamiliar produce. He photographed the Martinez children playing on swings that squeaked with age, but still carried them toward the sky with reliable joy. He photographed the community garden where elderly residents grew tomatoes and herbs that reminded them of countries they had left decades ago, but still carried in their hearts. And as the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across Riverside Park, Michael found himself standing before the memorial bench that bore his mother's name. The bench where Eleanor had told him Thomas Harrington came every evening to watch children play. The bronze plaque was smaller than he had expected, and the words were simpler. In memory of Lin Chen, beloved teacher and mother. Her love lives on in the community she served. Someone had left flowers recently, not the expensive arrangements that marked formal commemorations, but the kind of wildflowers that children pick from vacant lots because they recognize beauty wherever they find it. Michael sat on the bench and tried to imagine what his mother would want him to do with the information that had been revealed today. Would she want him to seek revenge against the man who had refused to acknowledge his existence? Would she want him to expose the historical injustices that had shaped their neighborhood's development? Would she want him to find some way to forgive the unforgivable, to build bridges where none had existed before? The answer, when it came, arrived not as words, but as a memory of his mother's voice, explaining fractions at their kitchen table. The family is not broken, she had said. It is just shared differently. Perhaps justice was like that too, not about punishment or revenge, but about sharing truth in ways that allowed healing to begin. Perhaps confronting Thomas Harrington wasn't about destroying him, but about giving him the chance to choose differently than he had 25 years ago. As evening approached and the playground began to fill with the sounds of families gathering for dinner, Michael remained on the memorial bench, waiting for the father who would arrive soon to unknowingly sit beside the son he had abandoned, both of them drawn to the same place by forces they were only beginning to understand. The October wind carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant possibilities, and somewhere in the space between memory and hope, between justice and mercy, a reckoning 25 years in the making was finally ready to begin. The sky above Riverside Park was painted in shades of amber and rose as the October sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting everything in the golden light that photographers call the magic hour. Children's voices carried across the playground like music from another world, a symphony of pure joy that seemed to exist outside the realm of adult complications and legal maneuvering. Michael sat on the memorial bench that bore his mother's name, his hands folded in his lap, watching families gather their children for the evening migration home to dinner tables and homework and bedtime stories. At exactly 6:15 p.m., as punctual as sunrise, Thomas Harrington appeared at the edge of the park. Michael recognized him immediately, though they had never met. 25 years of wandering had created a detailed mental image that proved remarkably accurate when confronted with reality. Thomas moved with the careful bearing of someone accustomed to command, his expensive overcoat a dark silhouette against the fading light. But there was something in his posture, a slight hesitation as he approached the bench, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with the authority he projected in every other aspect of his appearance, that revealed the deeper truth about why he came here. Thomas paused when he saw that his usual bench was occupied, his routine disrupted by the presence of a stranger who seemed completely absorbed in watching the children play. For a moment, he considered choosing a different vantage point, but something about the young man's stillness, his quality of patient observation, drew Thomas forward despite his discomfort with unexpected social interactions. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice carrying the polished neutrality he used with service workers and subordinates. "Do you mind if I share the bench? I usually sit here in the evenings." Michael looked up, meeting his father's eyes for the first time in his conscious memory. The resemblance was subtle, but undeniable. The same dark eyes, the same angular jawline, the same tendency to hold tension in the shoulders. But where Thomas's expression had been hardened by decades of emotional isolation, Michael's remained open, curious, touched with the kind of sadness that comes from understanding too much about human nature. "Of course," Michael replied, sliding over to make room. "It's a beautiful spot for watching the children play." Thomas settled onto the bench with the careful movements of someone whose body had been shaped by expensive ergonomic furniture and personal trainers, but whose spirit had been worn thin by years of occupying spaces designed for solitude. "Yes," he agreed, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure why he found it beautiful. "I come here most evenings. It helps me think." They sat in silence for several minutes, two strangers sharing a bench and a view of childhood innocence that seemed both achingly distant and mysteriously familiar. Michael watched his father from his peripheral vision, noting the way Thomas's hands rested on his knees, the way his breathing seemed to slow as he observed the playground, the way his expression softened almost imperceptibly when a particularly joyful burst of laughter reached them across the evening air. "Do you have children?" Michael asked finally, his voice carefully neutral despite the weight the question carried. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a tightness that had become familiar over the months of these evening vigils. "No," he said. And then, because something about the stranger's presence made honesty feel necessary, he added, Not that I've been involved with." The admission hung between them like smoke from an extinguished candle, visible and somehow significant. Michael absorbed the words, their careful phrasing, the pain they both revealed and concealed. His father had just acknowledged his existence, in the most oblique way possible, to the son he had never known. "That must be difficult," Michael said, and Thomas was surprised by the genuine compassion in the young man's voice. "Wondering about the roads not taken." "Yes," Thomas replied, though he had never articulated the feeling quite that way before. "I sometimes wonder what kind of father I might have been, whether I would have been any good at it." He paused, watching a father push his daughter on a swing set, both of them laughing as she soared higher with each push. "My own father wasn't particularly present. I suppose I convinced myself that some people aren't meant for family life. Michael felt a sharp pang of something that might have been sympathy, if sympathy could coexist with 25 years of abandonment. Do you think that's true, that some people aren't meant for family? Thomas considered the question with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for complex business negotiations. I used to think so, now I'm not sure. I think perhaps some people are afraid of family, afraid of the vulnerability it requires. The conversation was moving into territory that Thomas hadn't explored with anyone, including himself. There was something about this stranger's presence that invited confession, that made the carefully constructed barriers he had built around his emotional life seem suddenly permeable. Perhaps it was the setting, the memorial bench, in a place where families gathered to celebrate the simple miracle of being together. Perhaps it was the approaching darkness that made anonymity feel safe. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, some unconscious recognition that reached deeper than conscious thought. I work with families, Michael said, which was true without being complete. I help children who have been separated from their parents find their way back together. It's taught me that fear is usually stronger than love at first, but love is more persistent. Thomas turned to look at the young man more carefully, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the way his clothes were clean and well-maintained, but clearly not expensive. The calluses on his hands that suggested physical work alongside whatever professional responsibilities occupied his days. That must be rewarding work, Thomas said. And difficult. Both, Michael agreed. The hardest cases are the ones where parents have convinced themselves they're protecting their children by staying away. They tell themselves that absence is better than imperfection, that children are better off without them than with them. But children don't usually see it that way, they just experience the absence. They don't understand the reasoning behind it. The words hit Thomas like physical blows, each one landing with precision on wounds he had spent decades learning to ignore. This stranger was describing his own life with uncomfortable accuracy, revealing truths that Thomas had buried so deeply he had almost forgotten they existed. What do you do in those cases? Thomas asked, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. We try to help parents understand that children need them to try, even if they're imperfect. That showing up is more important than being perfect. That love expressed imperfectly is still love, but love unexpressed. That's just regret wearing a disguise. The playground was emptying now as families headed home for dinner, the laughter fading to occasional echoes as the last few children were gathered by patient parents. The streetlights began to flicker on, casting pools of warm light across the paths that wound through the park. In the growing darkness, the two men on the bench seemed to exist in their own small world, separated from the rest of the city by the weight of words being spoken for the first time. May I ask you something? Thomas said, though he wasn't sure where the question was leading. Of course. Do you believe in redemption? In the possibility that people can change, even after they've made terrible mistakes? Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer truthfully without revealing too much. I believe that change is always possible, but it requires two things that most people find very difficult, which are truth and courage. The truth to acknowledge what you've done wrong, and the courage to take action to make it right, even when that action feels impossible or terrifying. Thomas felt something breaking open in his chest, some carefully maintained dam that had been holding back a flood of emotions he had refused to acknowledge for 25 years. And if the mistakes are too old, if too much time has passed? Time doesn't erase the need for truth, Michael said gently, and it doesn't eliminate the possibility of healing. Sometimes the people we've hurt are more ready to forgive than we are to ask for forgiveness. They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the absence of conversation, but the presence of understanding that didn't require words. Around them, the park settled into its evening quiet, the last dog walkers making their way along the paths, the last joggers heading home to showers and dinners, and the ordinary comfort of lives lived in connection with other people. I should probably head home, Michael said finally, though he made no move to stand. My grandmother will be worried if I'm too late for dinner. Your grandmother? Thomas asked, though something about the word sent an unexpected chill through him. Yes. She raised me after my mother died. She's 73 now, but she still insists on cooking dinner every night, says it's the only way to make sure I eat properly. Thomas felt the world shift around him, pieces of information arranging themselves into a pattern he wasn't ready to recognize. Your mother, when did she die? When I was 7, 25 years ago. Michael's voice carried the kind of matter-of-fact sadness that comes from old grief that has been integrated into daily life. She was a teacher. She died quite suddenly. The memorial plaque beneath them seemed to pulse with significance, Lin Chen's name suddenly visible in the glow of the streetlight above. Thomas looked down at the bronze letters he had been unconsciously reading every evening for 8 months, then back at the young man beside him, whose eyes held depths Thomas was only beginning to fathom. "What was your mother's name?" Thomas asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Lin Chen," Michael replied, watching his father's face carefully. "Though I suppose you might have known her by her full name. Lin Chen Harrington." The world stopped spinning. Thomas felt every muscle in his body freeze, every breath catch in his throat, every carefully constructed defense collapse like a house of cards in an earthquake. The young man beside him, the stranger who had offered wisdom about family and forgiveness and the courage required for redemption, was his son. The child he had abandoned, the responsibility he had rejected, the family he had convinced himself he was too flawed to deserve. "Michael," Thomas whispered, the name feeling foreign and familiar simultaneously on his tongue. "Hello, Father," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I think it's time we talked." The memorial bench that had drawn them both to this place, that bore the name of the woman who connected them to each other, that had been installed by a community that understood the importance of remembering love, even in the face of loss, became the stage for a conversation that was 25 years overdue. And in the gathering darkness of an October evening, two men who had shared the same DNA but lived in completely different worlds began the delicate process of discovering whether it was possible to build a bridge across a chasm that had seemed unbridgeable for most of Michael's life. The truth, when it finally arrived, settled between them like dawn after the longest night, bringing both illumination and the promise that even the most carefully guarded secrets could not remain hidden forever. The silence that followed Michael's revelation stretched across the memorial bench like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of 25 years of unspoken words, unanswered questions, and carefully buried emotions. Thomas stared at his son's profile in the amber glow of the streetlight, his mind struggling to reconcile the articulate, compassionate young man beside him with the abstract concept of biological offspring that had occupied the margins of his consciousness for more than 2 decades. "You knew," Thomas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew who I was when you sat down." Michael nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the now empty playground where swings moved gently in the evening breeze like ghosts of children's laughter. "Elena Vasquez, my mentor. She discovered the connection while researching property records for the Riverside development. She's been building a case against your project." The mention of the legal challenge seemed to activate Thomas's business instincts, the part of his mind that had been trained to identify threats and neutralize them efficiently. But even as he felt the familiar surge of defensive calculation, another part of him, a part that had been dormant for decades, was overwhelmed by the simple fact that his son was sitting beside him, alive and whole and possessed of a quiet dignity that seemed to shine from within. "The injunction," Thomas said, pieces of the day's puzzle beginning to arrange themselves into a larger picture. "You're behind the legal challenge to my project." "We're behind it," Michael corrected gently. "Elena, myself, and about 300 families who call this neighborhood home, families who would be displaced by your vision of urban improvement." Thomas felt something twist in his chest, A combination of professional frustration and personal confusion that left him struggling for the kind of clear thinking that had guided him through decades of complex business negotiations. Michael, you have to understand, the development would bring jobs, increased tax revenue, better infrastructure. It would improve the entire area. For whom? Michael asked, turning to face his father directly for the first time. Better for the families who've lived here for generations, but won't be able to afford the new housing. Better for the small business owners who'll be replaced by boutique shops that serve people from other neighborhoods. Better for the children who'll lose their community center, their playground, their sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. The questions hung between them like accusations, but Michael's tone remained calm, almost conversational. Thomas had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even hatred from the son he had abandoned. Instead, he found himself facing something more challenging, genuine curiosity about how he justified decisions that caused such widespread displacement and disruption. "I never intended," Thomas began, then stopped, realizing that intention meant nothing in the face of impact. "I thought I was creating something better, more efficient, more valuable." "More valuable to whom?" Michael pressed, his years of social work having taught him to ask the questions that revealed underlying assumptions and hidden biases. "And what do you do with the value that already exists? The relationships, the history, the sense of community that people have built over decades?" Thomas looked around the park, seeing it as if for the first time. Not as underutilized urban space that could be optimized for higher economic return, but as a place where families gathered, where children learned to navigate friendship and conflict, where elderly residents found connection with neighbors who spoke their language and shared their stories. The memorial bench beneath him represented not just his mother's memory, but the community's commitment to honoring love even after loss, to maintaining connection across time and change. "I don't think about those things," Thomas admitted, the confession feeling like a physical weight lifted from his chest. "I think about square footage and profit margins and return on investment. I think about creating value, but I suppose I only know how to measure one kind of value." Michael studied his father's face in the streetlight, noting the way confession seemed to soften the harsh lines around his eyes, the way vulnerability made him appear both older and somehow more human. "What brought you here?" Michael asked. "To this bench, I mean. Why do you come here every evening?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to describe feelings he had never examined too closely. "At first I told myself it was market research, understanding family demographics for future projects, but that was a lie I told myself to make it acceptable." He paused, watching a late jogger disappear around a curve in the park path, leaving them alone with the weight of honesty that felt both terrifying and necessary. "I come here because I feel empty," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he committed to the truth. "I've spent 30 years building an empire, accumulating wealth and power and recognition, and none of it fills the space inside me. When I watch those families together, when I see fathers pushing their children on swings or mothers reading stories on blankets, I feel like I'm looking at a life I chose not to live." Michael felt something shift in his chest. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. You could have chosen differently. You still could choose differently. "Ooh, could I?" Thomas asked, and for the first time since Michael had known him to be his father, he sounded genuinely uncertain rather than commanding. "I'm 58 years old. I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be part of a family. I've built my entire life around avoiding exactly those kinds of connections." "Why?" Michael asked simply. The question pierced through decades of rationalization and psychological armor, reaching something raw and vulnerable that Thomas had been protecting since childhood. "Because my father was absent even when he was present. Because I learned that love was something you earned through achievement, and I was never quite good enough to earn it completely. Because I was afraid that if I tried to be a father, I would fail the way he failed, and it seemed better to avoid the attempt entirely than to risk repeating the cycle." Michael absorbed this information with the clinical attention of someone trained to understand family systems and generational patterns of dysfunction, but underneath his professional understanding was something more personal, a recognition that his father's abandonment had been motivated not by cruelty, but by fear, not by lack of love, but by terror of proving inadequate to love's demands. "What if you've been wrong?" Michael asked. "What if failure at love is better than absence from love? What if trying imperfectly is better than not trying at all?" Thomas felt tears gather in his eyes, an occurrence so rare that he had almost forgotten the physical sensation of overwhelming emotion seeking release. "Is it too late?" he whispered. "Have I lost the right to try?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, weighing his response not just as a son, but as someone who had dedicated his professional life to helping families heal from exactly this kind of fracture. Around them, the park settled into its evening stillness, the sounds of the city muffled by distance and darkness, creating a space that felt somehow sacred, set apart from the ordinary world where such conversations rarely happened. "I don't know if you have the right," Michael said finally, "but I think you have the opportunity. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price that opportunity demands." "What price?" "Truth about the harm you've caused, not just to me, but to this entire community. Accountability for the wealth you've built on foundations that were never rightfully yours. And change, real change, in how you use your power and privilege going forward." Thomas felt the conversation shifting from personal reconciliation to something larger and more challenging. "You want me to stop the development. I want you to understand what the development really means," Michael replied, "and then choose based on that understanding, rather than on profit calculations or abstract urban planning theories." Thomas looked around the park again, but this time he tried to see it through his son's eyes. The playground equipment was old, but well maintained, painted by community volunteers and designed for safety rather than aesthetics. The community garden in the corner showed evidence of careful tending, elderly residents growing vegetables that connected them to memories of countries they had left decades earlier. The memorial bench where they sat represented not just his personal connection to this place, but the community's commitment to honoring their dead through service to the living. "Show me," Thomas said. "Show me what I would be destroying." Michael felt something like hope stir in his chest, fragile and tentative, but undeniably present. "Are you sure? Once you really see it, you can't unsee it. Once you understand what's at stake, you'll have to choose between your business interests and your conscience." Thomas met his son's eyes, and for the first time in 25 years, he made a decision based on love rather than fear. "I'm sure. I want to understand. I want to see what you see." Michael stood, extending his hand to help his father up from the bench. As their hands touched, the first physical contact they had shared since Michael was too young to remember, both men felt the electric recognition of blood connection, of genetic similarity that had survived decades of separation. "Come on," Michael said, his voice carrying a mixture of determination and tenderness that reminded Thomas powerfully of Lin Chen, of the woman whose love he had rejected in favor of the safety of solitude. "Let me show you what home looks like." As they walked together toward the heart of the neighborhood that Thomas's company was planning to demolish, the memorial bench behind them stood as a silent witness to the beginning of something unprecedented. Not just a conversation between father and son, but the possibility that power could be transformed by love, that privilege could be redirected by conscience, and that even the most carefully constructed empires could be reimagined in service of justice rather than profit. The October wind carried the scent of wood smoke and distant rain, and somewhere in the space between what was and what might be, redemption began its patient work of transformation. The most powerful part of this transformation is watching both men realize that healing requires not just personal forgiveness, but systemic change. Are you ready to see how this father-son reunion reshapes an entire community? The next chapter will show you exactly what happens when love meets justice head-on. The walk from Riverside Park to Popo's herb shop took less than 10 minutes, but for Thomas Harrington, it was a journey through a world he had never truly seen, despite having studied it in demographic reports and market analyses for months. With Michael as his guide, the neighborhood transformed from statistical abstractions into a living tapestry of human connection, resilience, and quiet dignity that had somehow flourished in the margins of his empire's expansion. Their first stop was the community center where Michael worked, the converted Victorian house that had survived 3 demolition attempts through what seemed like stubborn architectural determination. As they approached the front steps, Thomas could see warm light spilling from the windows onto the sidewalk, and through the glass doors he glimpsed families gathered around tables where homework was being completed with patient assistance from volunteer tutors. "This is where your mother taught ESL classes," Michael said, his voice carrying the reverent tone people use when speaking of sacred spaces. 3 evenings a week for 5 years. She helped new immigrants learn the English they needed to navigate job interviews, parent-teacher conferences, medical appointments. She never charged for the lessons, said education was medicine, and medicine should be available to anyone who needed it. Thomas peered through the windows, at scene that seemed to glow with purpose. An elderly Somali woman was reading aloud from a children's book, while a volunteer gently corrected her pronunciation. A teenager was explaining algebra to a younger boy in a mixture of English and Spanish, both languages flowing seamlessly as understanding dawned on the child's face. A group of women sat in a circle, practicing conversation while their children played quietly nearby, their laughter punctuating discussions of grocery shopping and school events and the 1,000 small negotiations that comprise daily life in America. "How is this funded?" Thomas asked, his business instincts automatically cataloguing operational costs and revenue streams. "Donations mostly. Some grant money from the county. A lot of volunteer hours from people who remember when they needed help themselves." Michael opened the front door, and the sound of multiple conversations in multiple languages washed over them like music from a radio tuned to stations from around the world. Elena Vasquez looked up from a table where she was helping a young mother fill out paperwork for a housing assistance application. When she saw Thomas, her expression shifted to something between surprise and wariness, but she stood and approached them with the professional composure that had served her through years of difficult negotiations. "Mr. Harrington," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Elena Vasquez. We've been corresponding through our attorneys." Thomas shook her hand, noting the strength of her grip and the direct way she met his eyes. "Ms. Vasquez, I suppose I owe you an apology for my lawyer's behavior. They tend to approach challenges as problems to be eliminated rather than conversations to be had." Eleanor studied his face carefully, her legal training having taught her to read sincerity in body language and vocal tone. "Michael said you wanted to understand what the development would impact. Is this a genuine interest in dialogue, or are you gathering intelligence for a more sophisticated legal strategy?" "I honestly don't know," Thomas replied, and his admission of uncertainty seemed to surprise all 3 of them. 2 hours ago, I thought this was a simple matter of urban improvement being challenged by people who didn't understand economic development. Now I'm discovering that nothing about this situation is simple, and I'm not sure I understand anything at all." Elena nodded slowly, recognizing the kind of cognitive dissonance that sometimes preceded genuine transformation. "Would you like me to show you the impact assessment we prepared? The real one, not the sanitized version your planning committee used for public consumption." She led them to a wall covered with photographs, charts, and testimonials that told the story of the neighborhood from the perspective of the people who would be displaced by the development. Each family had been interviewed, their history in the community documented, their connections to local businesses and services mapped with the precision of an anthropological study. The Martinez family, Elena said, pointing to a photograph of 3 children playing in the very playground where Thomas sat every evening. Parents work at the medical complex downtown. Kids attend the elementary school 6 blocks away. Extended family lives within walking distance. Provides childcare and support during emergencies. If they're forced to relocate, they'll lose not just their home, but their entire support network. She moved to another photograph showing an elderly man tending to vegetables in the community garden. Mr. Chen, no relation to Michael's family, came here as a refugee from Vietnam 45 years ago. Lost everything twice, once to war and once to displacement. This garden isn't just recreation for him, it's therapy, connection to the soil that reminds him why he survived when others didn't. Thomas found himself studying each photograph with the attention he usually reserved for architectural plans and profit projections. But these images showed him something no spreadsheet could capture, the invisible infrastructure of care that held communities together, the networks of mutual aid that flourished in spaces he had categorized as underutilized. How many families would be displaced? Thomas asked. Directly, about 300 households. Indirectly, the economic ripple effects would impact thousands of people who depend on the small businesses, the community center, the informal networks of support that have developed here over decades. Michael watched his father absorb this information, noting the way confusion and distress played across features that had been trained for decades to project confidence and control. "Dad," he said, the word feeling strange but somehow natural on his tongue. "There's something else you need to see." They left the community center and walked 3 blocks to Popo's herb shop, the small storefront that had anchored the neighborhood's commercial district for 40 years. Through the window, Thomas could see shelves lined with glass jars containing dried roots, herbs, and remedies that connected this small space to medical traditions thousands of years old. The scent of ginseng and star anise drifted onto the sidewalk, mixing with the autumn air to create an olfactory bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary need. Popo looked up from her evening inventory as they entered, her weathered face breaking into a smile when she saw Michael, then shifting to polite curiosity as she registered the well-dressed stranger beside him. She spoke to Michael in rapid Mandarin, her tone carrying the gentle reproof of a grandmother who worried about missed meals and insufficient sleep. "Popo," Michael said in English, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Thomas Harrington, my father." The small shop fell silent, except for the soft ticking of an ancient clock on the wall behind the counter. Popo studied Thomas with the kind of penetrating attention that seemed to see through expensive clothes and practiced composure to something more essential underneath. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried the authority of someone who had survived wars, displacement, and decades of discrimination with her dignity intact. "So," she said, her English careful but clear, "you are the man who left my daughter to raise your son alone." Thomas felt the words hit him like physical blows, each one landing with the precision of someone who had spent 25 years thinking about what she would say if this moment ever arrived. "Yes," he replied, because anything other than complete honesty seemed impossible in the presence of this small, fierce woman who had raised his son with love he had been too afraid to offer. "Yes, I am that man." Popo continued to study him, her dark eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. Around them, the herb shop seemed to vibrate with accumulated stories. Immigrant families who had found healing for ailments that Western medicine couldn't address, elderly residents who had discovered community in conversations conducted across language barriers, children who had learned that medicine came in many forms, not all of them found in pharmacies or prescribed by doctors. "You know what this place means to people," Popo said finally. "You know what you take away when you build your towers here." "I'm beginning to understand," Thomas replied, "but I need to know more. I need to understand what I've spent my entire career not seeing." Popo walked to a cabinet behind the counter and withdrew a wooden box similar to the one that held Lin Chen's jade bracelet. Inside were letters, photographs, and documents that told the story of the neighborhood's development over 4 decades, an unofficial archive of survival and adaptation that no government office had bothered to maintain. "This land," Popo said, withdrawing a faded photograph that showed the neighborhood as it had existed in the 1950s, "belonged to my husband's family before the laws changed and they were forced to sell. The man who bought it was your grandfather. He paid 1/3 of what it was worth because Chinese families had no choice but to accept whatever was offered." She laid the photograph on the counter beside a more recent property deed that Elena had uncovered in her research. "Your family built wealth on land taken from mine. Your son grew up on soil that should have been his inheritance through his mother's line. The playground where you sit every evening was built on the foundation of our family garden." Thomas stared at the documents, at the photographic evidence of historical injustice that had been hidden in plain sight for 70 years. The memorial bench where he had unconsciously sought absolution was located on land his family had effectively stolen from the woman whose memory it honored, whose son he had abandoned, whose mother now stood before him offering not forgiveness, but the truth that made forgiveness meaningful. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "I want you to choose," Popo replied. "You can continue building wealth on the foundation of harm your family created, or you can use that wealth to repair what was broken. You can displace us again, or you can help us build something better where we are." Michael stepped forward, his role shifting from son to mediator, from wounded party to someone who understood that healing required more than acknowledgement of past harm. "Dad, Elena has been working on an alternative plan, something that would preserve the community while still creating the kind of development that brings economic opportunity." Elena opened her laptop and showed Thomas architectural renderings that had been prepared by community college students working with immigrant architects and urban planners. Instead of luxury towers that would price out existing residents, the plan called for mixed-income housing that included affordable units. Instead of boutique shopping that served affluent newcomers, it preserved spaces for the small businesses that had anchored the neighborhood for decades. Instead of erasing the community garden and playground, it expanded them into a central green space that connected rather than divided different income levels and cultural backgrounds. "It would cost more to build," Elena explained. "The profit margins would be lower, but the social return on investment would be immeasurable." Thomas studied the plans with the attention he had once reserved for projects that promised maximum financial return. But these drawings showed him something he had never imagined: the possibility that development could strengthen community rather than destroy it, that progress could lift people up rather than push them out, that wealth could be used as a tool for justice rather than an instrument of displacement. "How long would it take to implement something like this?" Thomas asked. "With your resources and political connections, 18 months, maybe 2 years, Elena replied. "But it would require completely restructuring your approach to this project. Different contractors, different financing, different relationships with city planning offices, different metrics for success." Thomas looked around the herb shop, at Popo's patient face, at Michael's hopeful expression, at the evidence of community resilience that surrounded them in the form of handwritten testimonials and photographs of neighborhood celebrations. Outside, the October evening had deepened into night, and through the window he could see families walking home from the community center, their conversations punctuating the darkness with laughter and multiple languages and the comfortable noise of people who belonged somewhere together. "I need to make some phone calls," Thomas said finally. "I need to talk to my lawyers, my contractors, my investors. I need to figure out how to transform a demolition project into something that builds rather than destroys." Popo nodded slowly, recognizing the beginning of commitment in his voice. "When you make those phone calls," she said, "remember that you are not just changing a business plan. You are choosing what kind of man you want to be, what kind of father, what kind of neighbor." As they prepared to leave the herb shop, Popo pressed a small packet of tea into Thomas's hands. "For sleeping," she explained. "When conscience awakens, sleep sometimes becomes difficult, but this will help." Thomas accepted the packet with the reverence of someone receiving a sacrament, understanding that it represented not just medicinal herbs, but an offering of care from someone who had every reason to hate him and every right to refuse him any form of healing. The walk back to where Marcus waited with the Bentley felt like a journey between worlds. From the warm, interconnected reality of Popo's neighborhood to the isolated luxury that had shaped Thomas's life for 5 decades. But something fundamental had shifted during those few hours of seeing through his son's eyes, of understanding the true cost of progress measured only in financial terms. As the Bentley carried him through the city toward his penthouse apartment, Thomas realized that the empty feeling that had driven him to the memorial bench every evening was gone, replaced by something that felt like purpose, frightening and exhilarating and utterly transformative. The ripple effects of that evening would spread far beyond the boundaries of the Riverside neighborhood, touching investors who would need to recalculate their expectations, city officials who would need to reconsider their definitions of urban improvement, and thousands of residents who would discover that sometimes, just sometimes, power chose justice over profit, and love proved stronger than fear. But the most profound transformation was happening in Thomas Harrington himself, as he began the difficult work of becoming the kind of man his son could be proud to know, the kind of neighbor Popo could trust, the kind of human being who used wealth as a tool for healing rather than an instrument of harm. The tea Popo had given him would indeed help him sleep. But first, there were phone calls to make, plans to change, and a lifetime of priorities to restructure in service of the family he was finally ready to claim. 12 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site where luxury condominiums had once been planned, but where something entirely different was taking shape. Instead of glass towers that would have pierced the sky like monuments to exclusion, the emerging buildings rose with gentle curves that seemed to grow from the earth itself, their facades incorporating materials and design elements that honored the neighborhood's cultural heritage while providing modern amenities that would benefit everyone who lived there. Michael stood at the edge of what had been the old playground, now expanded into a community green space that connected affordable housing units with market-rate condominiums through shared gardens, children's areas, and outdoor classrooms where Popo and other neighborhood elders taught traditional crafts and healing practices to anyone interested in learning. The memorial bench bearing his mother's name had been relocated to the center of the space, surrounded by flowering trees that bloomed in rotation throughout the seasons, ensuring that Lin Chen's memory was honored by beauty that changed and endured simultaneously. Thomas approached from the direction of the construction trailer where he had been meeting with community liaisons, architects and contractors whose work was guided not just by building codes and profit margins, but by principles of environmental sustainability and social justice that had required him to learn an entirely new vocabulary for success. At 59, he moved with the purposefulness of someone who had discovered that meaningful work felt different in his body than the mechanical accumulation of wealth had ever felt. "The community center renovation is ahead of schedule," Thomas said, settling onto the memorial bench beside his son. Their weekly meetings had become a ritual that neither of them acknowledged as such, but both treasured as time when the complicated work of rebuilding trust could proceed without the pressure of formal agenda or predetermined outcomes. "Eleanor says the legal clinic is already operating at capacity," Michael replied, watching children from the temporary playground chase each other through morning light that seemed to carry the promise of spring despite the February cold. Families are finally getting the kind of legal support they need to navigate immigration issues, landlord disputes, family court proceedings, things that should have been available years ago. Thomas nodded, still amazed by how much injustice had been hidden in plain sight during his years of willful blindness. The community legal clinic was only one component of the comprehensive development plan that had emerged from months of neighborhood meetings, design charrettes, and the kind of patient listening that his business education had never taught him to value. The affordable housing lottery results came back yesterday, Thomas said, consulting his phone, where he now kept track of social impact metrics alongside financial projections. 347 applications for 90 units. We're going to need to build more affordable housing in the next phase if we're serious about preventing displacement. Michael smiled, recognizing the tone of someone who had discovered that solutions often revealed new problems, but that the work itself was worth pursuing regardless of its complexity. That sounds like a problem you're looking forward to solving. It is, Thomas admitted, still surprised by how much satisfaction he derived from challenges that couldn't be resolved through the simple application of capital. Although I'll need Elena's help navigating the city planning process. My usual approaches to bureaucracy aren't well suited to projects that prioritize community benefit over developer profit. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the construction crews begin their daily work on buildings that represented something unprecedented in Thomas's development history, structures designed to strengthen rather than replace existing community networks, to provide homes for people who already lived in the neighborhood, rather than attracting newcomers who could afford to displace them. "I have something for you," Michael said, reaching into his backpack to withdraw a small package wrapped in tissue paper that smelled faintly of the medicinal herbs that permeated Popo's shop. "Popo wanted me to give you this." Thomas unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a jade carving about the size of his palm. A family of figures holding hands in a circle, their faces turned toward each other in expressions of joy and connection. The workmanship was exquisite, clearly the product of someone who understood jade not just as a material, but as a medium for expressing truths that words couldn't capture. "She carved this herself?" Thomas asked, running his fingers over the smooth stone that seemed to hold warmth despite the February cold. "She's been working on it since Christmas. Says it's a reminder that families can be broken and still be whole, can be scattered and still be connected. She wanted you to have something to hold when the work gets difficult and you forget why you're doing it." Thomas felt tears gather in his eyes, an occurrence that had become more frequent since he had begun the emotional work of reclaiming relationships he had spent decades avoiding. Popo's acceptance of him remained conditional, earned through daily choices rather than granted through blood connection. But her willingness to invest time in carving something beautiful for him represented a form of grace he was still learning to receive. "How is she feeling about the move?" Thomas asked. Popo's herb shop was being relocated to a larger space within the new community center, with the expanded classroom area where she could teach traditional medicine to anyone interested in learning. The transition was being handled with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for moving priceless artifacts, because everyone involved understood that some things couldn't be replaced if they were damaged in the process. "Excited and terrified in equal measure," Michael replied. "She's spent 40 years in that little storefront. Moving feels like losing something, even though the new space will let her serve more people more effectively. Change is hard, even when it's good change." Thomas nodded, understanding that truth from his own experience of the past year. Dismantling the business practices that had made him wealthy but morally bankrupt had required the kind of daily courage that felt more difficult than any corporate merger or hostile takeover he had ever negotiated. But it had also revealed capacities for connection and purpose that he hadn't known he possessed. "The university wants to create a case study," Thomas said, switching to the practical updates that had become part of their weekly conversations. They're calling it community-centered development, a model for equitable urban renewal. Apparently our approach is getting attention from planning departments in other cities. Michael looked pleased, but not surprised. Elena's been getting calls from legal aid organizations that want to understand how we built the community coalition, how we negotiated with city government, how we structured the financing to make affordable housing profitable for developers. Are you interested in that kind of work? Consulting on community development projects? Michael considered the question while watching a group of elderly residents walk slowly around the perimeter of the green space, their morning exercise routine adapted to accommodate walkers and wheelchairs with equal dignity. Maybe eventually. Right now, I'm still focused on finishing law school and learning how to be your son. The phrase hung between them with the weight of ongoing negotiation, the acknowledgement that their relationship remained a work in progress rather than something that could be resolved through good intentions or formal agreements. Thomas had spent the past year learning that love was a practice rather than a feeling, something that required daily attention and patience with setbacks and willingness to begin again when communication failed or old patterns reasserted themselves. I'm still learning how to be your father, Thomas replied, but I think I'm getting better at it. You are, Michael confirmed, and the simple validation felt like a gift Thomas was still learning to accept without immediately calculating what he owed in return. Elena Vasquez approached from the direction of the community center, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and her expression carrying the focused energy of someone juggling multiple complex projects simultaneously. At 46, she had found her life's work in the intersection of legal advocacy and community organizing, and the success of the Riverside development had brought opportunities to apply their model to other neighborhoods facing similar pressures. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, settling onto the memorial bench with the easy familiarity of someone who had become family through shared struggle rather than blood connection. "I have updates on 3 different fronts, and I need to know how ambitious we're feeling about the next phase." Thomas and Michael exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that meant Eleanor had discovered new possibilities for expanding their impact beyond the boundaries of their original project. Over the past year, they had learned to trust her instincts about what communities needed and what systems change required, even when her suggestions challenged their assumptions about what was possible or practical. "The City Housing Authority wants to partner with us on affordable housing development in the South Side," Elena began, consulting notes on her phone. "They're offering land acquisition support and expedited permitting in exchange for our commitment to include community ownership components in the financing structure." "Community ownership?" Thomas asked, his business background making him immediately curious about the financial mechanics involved. "Resident equity sharing, community land trusts, cooperative ownership structures that prevent speculation and maintain affordability permanently rather than temporarily," Elena explained. "It's more complex than traditional development, but it creates wealth for residents rather than extracting it from them." Michael felt excitement building in his chest as he imagined the ripple effects of development that strengthened rather than displaced existing communities. What would we need to make that work? Different financing, different legal structures, different relationships with contractors and suppliers. Basically, we'd need to scale up everything we've learned here while adapting it to neighborhoods with different histories and different needs. Thomas found himself nodding before he had fully processed all the implications of what Elena was describing. A year ago, he would have immediately calculated profit margins and return on investment timelines. Now his first thoughts went to impact assessments and community benefit measurements, to questions about how development could strengthen social networks rather than disrupting them. "What's the timeline?" he asked. "If we started planning immediately, we could break ground in 18 months, but it would require committing significant resources to community engagement before we knew exactly what the financial return would look like." "The financial return isn't the most important return," Thomas said, surprised by how natural the words felt. If we can create a model that other developers can replicate, if we can prove that community-centered development is financially sustainable, the long-term impact could be enormous. Michael looked at his father with something approaching pride, recognizing the transformation that had occurred not just in Thomas's business practices, but in his fundamental understanding of success, progress, and responsibility. The man who had once sat alone on a memorial bench, unconsciously seeking absolution for abandonment, had become someone who used his privilege in service of healing rather than harm. "There's something else," Elena said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "Michael, the state bar examination results came out yesterday." Michael felt his stomach tighten with anticipation and anxiety. After 3 years of night school, weekend study sessions, and the kind of exhausting balance between full-time work and academic demands that tested every reserve of energy and determination he possessed, his future as a lawyer depended on exam results that would determine whether all that sacrifice had been worthwhile. "And?" Thomas asked, his parental pride evident despite his attempt to remain calm. "Congratulations, counselor," Eleanor said, grinning as she handed Michael an official envelope with the state bar seal. "You passed. You're officially qualified to practice law in this state, which means our community legal clinic just gained its first staff attorney." Michael stared at the envelope with disbelief that gradually transformed into something like joy. All the late nights studying contract law by the light of flickering desk lamps, all the mornings when exhaustion made concentration feel impossible, all the moments when he had wondered whether pursuing law school while working full-time was sustainable, all of that had led to this moment when dreams became credentials, and credentials became the ability to advocate for families like the ones he had grown up among. Thomas felt tears gathering in his eyes as he watched his son absorb the magnitude of his achievement. "I'm proud of you," he said, the words carrying the weight of 25 years of unexpressed paternal feeling. "Your mother would be proud of you." Michael looked up from the envelope to meet his father's eyes, and for a moment, the memorial bench where they sat seemed to vibrate with the presence of Lin Chen, whose love had shaped her son even in her absence, whose memory had drawn father and son to the same place until truth could finally bridge the distance between them. "She would be proud of both of us," Michael replied. "She would be proud that we chose healing instead of hatred, justice instead of revenge, building instead of destroying." Around them, the construction site hummed with the sounds of creation, hammers and power tools, and the voices of workers building something unprecedented in Thomas Harrington's development history. But underneath those immediate sounds was something deeper and more permanent. The laughter of children playing in expanded green spaces, the conversations of neighbors discovering shared interests across cultural and economic boundaries, the quiet satisfaction of elderly residents who had found their community strengthened rather than scattered by change. The memorial bench that bore Lin Chen's name had become the center of a neighborhood transformed, a place where love had proven stronger than fear, where justice had emerged from the patient work of truth-telling and community building, where a father and son had learned that families could be broken and still be whole, scattered and still be connected. As the February sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the jade carving in Thomas's hands and illuminating the construction site, where affordable housing rose alongside market-rate condominiums, where community gardens flourished alongside modern amenities, where past harm was being transformed into present healing, 3 people who had found family through shared commitment to justice sat together in comfortable silence, planning the next phase of work that would extend their model of community-centered development to neighborhoods throughout the city. The legacy Lin Chen had created through her love for her son and her service to her community lived on in the buildings rising around them, in the legal clinic that would provide advocacy for families who needed it most, in the father who had learned to use his privilege in service of healing, and in the son who had chosen to build bridges rather than walls between past hurt and future possibility. The October wind that had carried secrets through the city streets a year earlier had been replaced by February breezes that carried the scent of new growth, the sounds of construction, and the promise that even the most carefully guarded separations could be transformed into connection when love proved patient enough to wait for justice, and justice proved strong enough to sustain love. The story that had begun with a tycoon sitting alone on a bench, watching children play in a neighborhood he planned to destroy, had become something larger and more hopeful, a testament to the possibility that power could be transformed by conscience, that wealth could be redirected by love, and that even the most profound abandonment could be healed when people chose truth over comfort, community over isolation, and justice over the perpetuation of harm. In the end, the memorial bench remained exactly where Lin Chen's community had placed it, but everything around it had been transformed by the patient work of building the kind of world she had envisioned. A world where families stayed together, where communities supported their most vulnerable members, where love proved stronger than fear and healing proved more powerful than harm. The legacy lived on, growing stronger with each passing season, rooted in truth and sustained by the daily choice to build rather than destroy, to include rather than exclude, to heal rather than harm. And in the space between memory and hope, between past hurt and future possibility, love continued its patient work of transformation, one family, one neighborhood, one generation at a time. This story reminds us that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration, healing, and the courage to transform systems that cause harm into systems that nurture life. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is choosing to build something beautiful where destruction was planned. What moment in this journey touched you most deeply? Was it the father's recognition of his son, the grandmother's wisdom, or the community's resilience? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove love, patience, and justice can transform even the most broken situations into something beautiful.